Okay, so in this tutorial we're going to learn how to make a rolling trance bassline using Massive and Logic's own ESM synth. This particular bassline has kind of two parts to it. It has a deeper subby element and a higher high-pass filtered version that's processed and treated differently. But before we look into how the patch is made and how it's kind of put together and mixed, etc., let's just have a little listen to what we'll end up with, also including the type of trance chords and the type of trance synths that will also be commonly found in tracks with bass lines such as this. We'll also have a little listen to it without the chords as well, so we can just concentrate and focus on the drums and the bass a little bit more this time. So the first thing we'll do is we'll have a little look at the Massive preset that we've created for this. Just stick the loop back on here and we'll just see also the MIDI programming for a bass line like this. So trance bass lines such as this tend not to have a note on each downbeat of the bar, so there's space for the kick. It's kind of like the same idea as sidechain compression, getting the volume out of the way for the kick to pull through. So they generally are programmed with 3 notes to each beat, starting on the second 16th or second semiquaver. So we'll just have a little listen to this without the kick drum in isolation. So that kind of has a bit of a galloping quality, and it changes dramatically as soon as you add the kick drum in. So we'll start playing it again and then I'll just unsolo the kick so you can hear the difference it makes. Okay, so this is really made up of simply just a square wave that's tuned down quite a bit. You could program the MIDI notes lower, but for some reason in here we've just detuned this by an octave. We're not using any of the other oscillators, so it is just all square for this. There's no special sort of filtering put on. There is a low pass activated there, but we can turn that off and it won't make any difference to the tone. A touch of resonance, but it doesn't really come into play there. The envelope has been set so there's quite a quick attack, no decay, full sustain, and then a very quick release as well. So hardly any release, pretty much a full decay and sustain level here, and a very, very quick attack, but just not perfectly set down to nothing, just to get rid of some kind of clickiness that was inherent in the patch. But we basically just want a static tone, static square wave tone that will sustain throughout. And as in some of the other tutorials, the processing is basically all done as inserts, and we've just got 3 here. We've got a EQ, a compressor, and a second EQ. But it's the main EQ that's the important one. It changes and sculpts the shape of that square wave and this sort of timbre and sound around it. So we're just going to go through playing this back and listening to the differences as each band of the EQ is switched on and activated. So I'm just going to turn these off for the moment. Just turn those off there, and we'll have a little listen to this, bringing them back in one by one. So we can hear there that the main one here really is this big sub 100 Hz boost that is about 16 dB in level and starts roughly 120 Hz further on, but the low shelf EQ really adds weight to that bass tone. There's a very, very subtle nip out at around about 200 Hz, a very, very narrow scoop relatively. Usually those are quite wide, but in this instance we've just nipped a tiny bit of the tone out with that, and again we'll remove just a touch of the brightness with a very wide Q cut here. So it's not a narrow focus one, it's a very broad attenuation that we're achieving here with this part of the EQ, just to knock a little bit of brightness off the tone, because it really is the sub frequencies that we're interested in this particular version and this particular type of bassline. We do have some higher frequencies added back in, but that is through a sort of specialized version there, which we'll come to later. So let's just have a little listen to that and bypass the whole of the EQ and switch it back on so you can listen to it with and without the differences. So we can hear that makes a absolutely massive difference to the tone and makes it like a really powerful, driving, rolling bassline sound that is synonymous with the kind of Armin van Buuren type trance tracks that are doing the scene at the moment. So the next thing we've got is a bit of sidechain compression, and even though the MIDI notes, if we remember, and we have a look back in here, even though the MIDI notes aren't actually playing on the kicks, some of these second notes might get in the way, and we basically have a volume ducking through that sidechain compression, so that these first parts of this note, and maybe even affect some of that note, does get swelled up in volume, which again helps with that kind of rolling pace of a rolling bass line. So we'll just play that again with the sidechain compression on, and I'll also turn the kick drum back on because it will really be much more noticeable with the kick there as well. So it's relatively subtle, but it just adds to the technique a little bit and does make that sort of pumping effect a little bit noticeable with the first note of after each kick drum. And finally, to kind of finish off the sort of sub element of the rolling bass line, we're just nipping out everything below 35 Hz. It's just a bit of housekeeping again, as shown in previous tutorials. We're just high passing this because it's not really necessary to have anything below sort of 30 Hz in that kind of region. So this is just a little bit of housekeeping here to maintain some headroom for further down the line when we mix and master the tracks. So you can hear that it does actually change the tone. I'll take the kick drum out of the equation here so we can hear it. It does thin the tone out slightly, but it doesn't really impact on the role that the bass line plays, and it doesn't really make a detrimental effect to the outcome. So it's better to save a bit of sub energy here and use some of that amplitude that part would have been taking up for loudness maximization and mastering. You can also, of course, move the filter further down and just get it to start at maybe 25 Hz or maybe even 30. But in this particular instance, we've gone for 35 because we don't think that it's actually impacting in a negative fashion to the bass line. So that there with it on is still very bassy and will still drive the track along. So we'll just put that kick drum back in and you'll see that it still doesn't lose its effectiveness as it's rolling the bass. So that's that part done, and basically we've just made the exact same thing on an ES1 just to show that this can be done with any synthesizer. It doesn't have to be an expensive third-party one like Massive. It can be done with the inbuilt presets in Logic and can basically be done with any synth that has a decent square wave oscillator. So I'm just going to mute that track there, and we've just got the ESM version here, and it should sound pretty much identical. So the same EQ and compression settings and high pass filtering have been applied to that as well, and that works almost exactly the same. It sounds pretty much identical to the version from Massive. So the next part of this bassline tutorial is really all about the high pass filtered version. Now in a previous tutorial we have actually looked at doing this type of technique, but by sending a copy of the bassline to a bus. But in this case all that's been done is it's actually been copied across, and the MIDI part has been sequenced as well, and it's exactly the same, except it does have that first note because the bass frequencies aren't low enough to actually interfere with the kick drum, so we've actually included those back in here as part of the MIDI region, just to give it a bit more of an interesting texture to the sound. So I'm just playing this on its own with the kick drum and leave the deep bass out of it, just so you can hear this high pass filtered version. I'll just show you where the high passes come in. We've cut off everything below 400 Hz, and we've given it quite a good high shelf EQ to just really worry about the brighter elements of this tone. So we'll take all of these off and look through them one by one at the processing that's gone on. So now we should pretty much have the same similar sort of square wave bass, but without the heavy EQ that was applied to this one, so it should be a bit thinner in texture. Another thing that has been done to this is the note length has actually been shortened as well. So as you can hear, it's a bit more percussive and a bit more rhythmical in its kind of amplitude settings, because basically the note length has been shortened, so we've made it a quicker note than its sub-bass counterpart. So you see those ones there are longer. So we'll have a little listen here to this new layer with the EQs and delays and processing added back in. So we'll just have a look at these first two to start with. So this is with it back with the EQ, we're cutting out all the low end of that as well as brightening up the top. Next we're going to add in just a tiny bit of delay, some relatively quick ones on the right side and then a crotchet delay on the left input, and then blend it in at a very subtle level. And to start with, this will actually make the bass line quite muddy and cluttered, and it won't help with the clarity, but it is adding some rhythmic interest that we'll deal with the clarity aspect of this later on down the processing strip. And because these delays are only mixed in very subtly and they've got the low cuts on them and stuff, they're not actually too disruptive to the rhythms. But again, just add a little bit of an interesting texture to the sound. But these delays will become much more noticeable after the next series of processing, because we've actually added in quite a significant amount of distortion and overdrive. We've also added in some modulation effects as well. And we'll see how those impact on the tone. So we'll just turn the drive one up to start with. We see that we haven't made the kind of amplitude increase from the drive back up with the output. We haven't turned that down to minus. We have done a little bit on the main distortion one as opposed to the overdrive one, because it's a bit more of an extreme version of the overdrive. And we can see that the filters are pretty much fully open on both of these as well, so there's no low pass filtering going on with this. So let's just hear it with the overdrive now. And then with the extra distortion as well. And you should be able to hear there that it's not just the tone that's changing with the overdrive, but actually the sustain of those delays is being brought up, because by overdriving the signal you are incurring a type of almost a natural compression through driving up the level to its kind of maximum amplitude. So by distorting you are kind of reducing the dynamic range between the loudest and quietest part, which is making those delayed, the tails of those delays, a bit more prominent in the mix as well. Which is quite good for what we want at the moment. So it's making it a little bit cluttered in terms of its rhythmic integrity, but it does add a nice texture to it, so it is worth kind of having that in at the moment. And next we've got what can usually be an either or type scenario. We're adding in some modulation to this, so it's going to add a bit of stereo width to the signal, and it is also going to change the tone over time. So as this plays, when you turn the flanger on, the distorted synth here is actually going to change its tone as the flanger sweeps up and down at a very, very slow rate of modulation. And these detunings and these feedbacks, etc., are going to make a nice progression to the sound. It's going to keep the sound evolving and changing over time. So let's have a little listen to that with the flanger on. And now with it off. And now with it back on. So again, we can hear that that's adding some stereo width and is changing the tone as it goes. Similar sort of thing is happening with the chorusing here, with the scanner vibrato. We're using the first chorus preset on there. We're making the depth quite high, so it's going to affect a lot of the signal. And we're offsetting the left and the right in terms of the rates of modulation. So that should also add some nice stereo width with the different detuning rates. And by changing the rates, you could make it more of a subtle effect, but I quite like it with quite high rates in combination with the flanger. That works quite nicely in this particular effect, but usually you would actually use either or. You'd either use a choruser, a flanger, or possibly a phaser as well. One of the three would usually be employed, but in this particular tutorial I'm actually going to use both because they work quite nicely and dovetail with one another. And next we're going to add in, to make those delays pump in time with the music, we're going to add some sidechain compression. So all those delays that we're starting to clutter up a little bit are going to get pumped in volume against the kick drum, and we're going to have some nice sidechain compression added to that as well. So just solo the sidechain, play this, and then we'll hear the difference when the sidechain comes on. So you can hear there that the difference is quite radical with that sidechain. I'll just put the kick in as well, because sidechain stuff really works best and can be heard in much greater detail when you actually have the kick drum working alongside it. So we'll just start for the first half, this first MIDI region there. We'll play it without the sidechain compression turned on, and then we'll switch it on when we move over to that one. So that's working quite nicely. Next we're going to employ the Haas effect. I'm going to offset the left hand side by 600 samples or so. So again, this will add to the sense of stereo width, and because the first synth is very mono in tone, and because the lower end of this is going to stay very central in the stereo image, it's quite nice to have a bit of width on the higher frequency parts. So we're just going to play this back through and audition it and turn it on and off so you can hear how the harsh effect is working and creating some stereo width to that signal. So it's just pushing the stereo image out further as well. And finally, just to finish off, we're going to add in another high pass filter to roll off to the same amount as we did at the start. We're not adding in the high frequency boost as well, because we don't want to brighten anything up anymore. But what we do want to do is get rid of some of the low frequency energy that has been put back into the signal through these distortion units. So the distortion units themselves have incurred low frequency energy, and we're just going to clear those up with this high pass filter here. So we just thin that out in tone a touch. So we can see all that low energy there. We want to get rid of that, because we don't want that low energy that's down there fighting with the sub-frequencies from the original bassline. So let's just put these back together so we can get a sense of what they sound like. And I'll just solo and unsolo the high frequency element here as this plays back, so you can get an idea of the difference that that high frequency element does make to the overall aesthetics and holistic qualities of a rolling trance bass line like this. So we can hear there, it makes a big difference to the overall aesthetics of the sound. So we'll just unmute those and have a listen to this all back together. And that's pretty much how it's done. That is how you make a rolling trance bass line.